You're irritating me, and so because I am impatient and frustrated with you, get out of my way. Because if that's ever the attitude, then they realize they have a higher responsibility for God to have the sweetness and the love that God tells them to have. Because the one that is older, God requires more of them. And when you are being impatient with them, you're giving them the message of, you know what, you're not valuable to me, you're in my way.
There is a moment in every legal case where a defendant's own actions become the prosecution's best evidence. Joseph Duggar may have just handed prosecutors one of those moments, and the strange part is, it happened inside a routine court filing. Everything discussed here comes from public court records, verified news reporting, and official legal documents. Most people know the Duggar name from the long-running reality television series 19 Kids and Counting, which aired on TLC for years and built the family into a household name. Josh Duggar, the eldest son, was convicted in 2021 on federal child sexual abuse material charges and is currently serving a 12-year federal prison sentence. That conviction reshaped how the public views the entire family. But this story is not about Josh. This story is about his younger brother, Joseph Duggar, and a legal situation that has been escalating quietly in Florida courts for months. Joseph Duggar is currently facing a serious felony charge in the state of Florida. The specific charge carries potential life imprisonment. He has been released on bond while the case moves forward, and like most defendants in that position, he was given a set of release conditions to follow. Those conditions were not complicated. Stay away from locations connected to the person impacted by the case. Do not make contact. Keep a minimum distance of 500 feet. These are standard protective measures in cases involving allegations of this nature, and courts take violations seriously. What happened next is where the story takes a turn that is hard to explain away. On May 18th, 2026, Joseph Duggar's legal team filed two separate motions with the court. The first asked for modification of his no-contact conditions so he could spend time with his children. The second asked for modification related to properties he owns. On the surface, these filings are not unusual. Defendants seek bond modifications regularly. But buried inside that second motion was something that should never have appeared on a public court docket. The state of Florida has a statute known as Marcy's Law. Under this law, any information that could publicly identify the location or identity of a person impacted by a crime is classified as strictly confidential. That protection covers current addresses. It also covers former addresses. The reasoning is straightforward. Even an old address can be used to track someone. The motion filed by Joseph Duggar's defense team included an address. According to the state's subsequent filing, that address was connected to the family of the person impacted in this case. It was placed on a fully public court docket without the required confidentiality protections, in apparent violation of Marcy's Law. The state moved quickly. Prosecutor J.P. Ferrer filed a formal notice of confidential information within a court filing, citing Florida Rule of Judicial Administration 2.420-D2. That filing identified the precise location of the confidential information within the defense motion and formally notified the clerk of the court that the document required immediate review. Here is where the timeline gets more complicated, and this is the part that most coverage has not focused on clearly enough. Inside the same motion where the address appeared, Joseph Duggar's legal team made a factual claim to the court. They stated that the property in question had been abandoned, that the people connected to the case had packed up and moved out. Think about what that claim requires. In order to represent to a court that a property is vacant, someone has to know it is vacant. Someone had to verify that. Under the terms of Joseph Duggar's existing no-contact order, no one connected to him, not his associates, not family members acting on his behalf, is permitted to go within 500 feet of locations connected to the protected party. That prohibition exists precisely to prevent any form of monitoring, surveillance, or intimidation. If someone physically verified that property was empty, that act itself may constitute a bond violation. The defense motion does not explain how this information was obtained. It simply asserts the property was abandoned as a stated fact. That gap is what prosecutors now have in front of them. The consequences being discussed publicly range significantly. At the lower end, the address gets sealed, the motion gets denied, and the filing is treated as a procedural error. At the higher end, Joseph Duggar's attorney could face sanctions or a report to the Florida State Bar for exposing confidential victim information. And if prosecutors pursue the question of how the defense obtained knowledge about the property's status, the bond violation issue comes directly into view. Bond revocation in cases like this is rare. But it is not off the table, particularly when a defendant facing a life felony charge appears to have knowledge he should not legally possess. What makes this situation worth paying attention to is the pattern it suggests. This is not a single misstep. The record in this case already includes a failure to appear and prior traffic violations. And now a court filing that simultaneously seeks a modification of protective conditions while apparently exposing the protected party's former address, the same address the motion claims is no longer occupied. That is a contradiction that prosecutors did not create. The defense created it themselves. The clerk of the court now has a defined window under Florida procedural rules to determine whether the information meets the standard for confidentiality protection. If the clerk confirms it does, the document gets sealed. If the defense contests that determination, it escalates. Either way, the state has a documented record of this filing that will not disappear from the case file. A federal jury found Josh Duggar guilty in 2021. What a Florida jury ultimately finds in the case of Joseph Duggar is still an open question. But what is not an open question is this. When you are facing a life felony and released on bond, the absolute last thing you want is to hand the prosecution a new set of questions about whether your conditions were followed. And yet, that is precisely what this filing appears to have done. Whether this was a careless oversight by a defense team operating under pressure or something more deliberate is something the court will evaluate. What is clear from the public record is that a document meant to expand Joseph Duggar's freedom may have instead tightened the walls around him. That is worth watching closely.